Hello again, welcome back to my channel. Now, last week we were looking at John 8:58 and Exodus 3:14 and looking at the Hebrew and the Greek and determining whether there was any grammatical connection to the two verses. And we saw that there was not. So I'm going to just recap briefly that evidence again from the original languages. But then I'm going to go on and examine John chapter 8 and the verses leading up to verse 58, because I want to have a look at what was being said there, what Jesus was trying to get across to the Pharisees and what they were thinking, and to clear up some of the misunderstandings of this contextual conversation that I believe many Trinitarians have misunderstood, misapply, and Arians like the Jehovah's Witnesses, who also look at this passage for another reason, trying to prove that Jesus pre-existed in heaven before coming to the earth, they also have misunderstood this passage. Now, it's a passage I've been looking at for about 40 years, on and off. And some years ago, I thought I'd come to a full understanding of what was going on in this passage. But in recent years, I've discovered some more thinking on it, more books where I've learned um, interesting contextual information that just throws whole new light on this chapter and what's been spoken about here. So we're going to go into that now and explain something that, as I say, I've had a eureka moment and now think I've come to a much fuller understanding of these verses, which I'm going to share with you over this and maybe a couple of more videos in the near future. So first of all, as I said, I'm going to recap quickly just some of the information we looked at before. So hopefully you'll see this on green. So we're looking at the Exodus 3:14, I am that I am. And we saw that this expression here, Ehe, Asher, Ehe, is the corresponding Hebrew. And again, I am hath sent me unto you. And there the Hebrew word Ehe is the word that's been translated here as I am. And just looking at a Septuagint translation of this passage, we see here in verse 14, this is the Oxford Annotated Bible, which is very good. And it says here in verse 14, and God said to Moses, I am the one who is. And he said, thus shall you say to the sons of Israel, the one who is has sent me to you. Now, this again correctly shows that this passage doesn't have to be translated as I am who I am or I am that I am. It's translated as I am the one who is. The one who is has sent me to you, which is not what Jesus is saying in John 8:58 when he says I am. So it's a different expression. Now, the Hebrew word ehi that gets translated as I am in some translations, it really means more than just simply to exist. I'll come out of sharing just for a moment because I want to show you or read to you from the Jewish Study Bible, which I have. And on this passage, when they're reading it in English, they actually just say, God said to Moses, Eche, Asher, Eche. They don't try to translate it. They just transliterate the original Hebrew. Eche has sent me to you. So they avoid the whole I am expression altogether. And in the explanatory footnotes at the side, it's talking about how Eche derives from the Tetragrammaton, the divine name Yahweh. It says that God's answer in verse 14, Eche Asher Eche, is actually an explanation of its meaning, an explanation of the name Yahweh or Jehovah. Probably best translated as I will be what I will be, right? Not I am that I am, or I am what I am, but I will be what I will be, meaning my nature will become evident from my actions, right? Um, you shall know that I am the Lord. Then he answers Moses' question, tell them, Eche, I will be, sent me. This explanation derives God's name from the Hebrew verb hawa, a variant of haya, to be. Grammatically, Yahweh means he who is, or he who will be. Perhaps most likely, he who causes things to be. Okay, so that gives us the explanation that Eche is an explanation in itself of the divine name Yahweh. He will be what he will be, what he will prove to be, what he will cause to be. So it's not talking about just simply pure existence or eternalness, although that's part and parcel of it. But it's not just that, it's about who God will prove himself to be by his actions. And again, I'll just quickly share screen and you'll hopefully see I've got here it's another Jewish commentary, the Soncino or Sonkino Jewish commentary, and this is Ezekiel chapter 14 and verse 11. And the verse talks about they may be my people and I may be their God. Not I am their God, but I may be their God. And of course, if we look into the Hebrew text, there we are. There's the Hebrew word eche. I may be, not I am. Okay, so that's the explanation of the Hebrew term. I'm going to just go up into as a reminder, in the Septuagint that we looked at last time, where again the expression I am the being, tell them, the children of Israel, the being has sent me to you. We saw that the Greek Septuagint uses the expression ego eimi ho on, and the ho on is the term that's repeated. So it's not the ego eimi that's repeated, but the ho on, and that is the name in Greek for eche, ho on. Okay, and then we looked at John chapter 8 and verse 58. And this is a Hebrew English interlinear that I have. And we see here in verse 58, before Abraham was, I am. And if we look at the Hebrew text, that's the end. These two dots, it means it's the end of verse 58. And there we are, Ani who, I am he. That's the Hebrew expression there, Ani who, not Eche. And again, interestingly, if we go down to chapter 9 and verse 9, talking about the blind beggar, it says, but he said, I am he. And if we look at the end of verse 9, which is here, again we see Ani who, I am he. So the exact same expression that the blind beggar uses here in Hebrew, Ani who, is exactly the same one that Jesus uses in verse 58 of chapter 8, Ani who, in other words, I am he. So both in the Greek and in the Hebrew, there is no connection between what Jesus was saying and what Yahweh is saying in the burning bush in Exodus 3. So that's that. So we're going to look at this passage in John 8:58 in a bit more depth and see what is actually going on in John chapter 8. And we're going to see what Jesus actually meant and how the Pharisees misunderstood what he was talking about. They just didn't get the gist of what he was saying and completely misunderstand him. So to do that, we're going to look at a passage from the patristic writer, theologian Origen, one of the early church fathers from the 2nd and 3rd centuries. Now, I was doing this as part of my university studies last term, and this is a passage from Origen's writing on his preface to the Gospel of John, his commentary in the Gospel of John. And he's talking here about the patriarchs, including Abraham, and how they understood. Well, it ties in with what Jesus is saying in John 8:58. But in truth, what we'll do is, first of all, before we look at that, we'll actually have a look at the passage in John from the Bible Gateway. And let's see, in verse 39, it says, they answered him, Abraham is our father. Jesus said to them, if you are Abraham's children, you would do what Abraham did. But now you're trying to kill me, a man who has told you the truth that I heard from God. This is not what Abraham did. Okay, so Jesus is saying to them, you should be acting the way Abraham acted. So how was that? Now I'm going to I'll come out of here for the moment. Just want to come out of the share screen. There we are. So just for 1 moment. Yeah, I want to actually just read this passage from the Message, which is a very good modern translation, which in modern English paraphrasing, and I think Peterson, the writer, captures what's going on here really well. So if you bear with me, I'll just read a few lines from this. So they're asking Jesus who he is, who does he think he is? What authority does he have? And Jesus explaining that he's sharing with them what he's learned from the Father. It's the Father's words that he's speaking, and the Father has sent him. And they're asking, where is this so-called Father of yours? Jesus said, you're looking right at me, and you don't see me. How do you expect to see the Father? If you knew me, you would at the same time know the Father. So Jesus is saying, you've heard what I've been preaching. You can see what I'm doing. You should see that it's the Father that's working through me. But you're just not getting it. You're not seeing what I'm doing. And you're not hearing my words so as to know who I'm representing. Jesus said, you're tied down to the mundane. I'm in touch with what is beyond your horizons. You live in terms of what you see and touch. I'm living on other terms. I told you that you were missing God in all this. See, Jesus is saying that you're just not getting the point. You say you know Abraham, Abraham's your father, and you know the scriptures. He says, but you're just not getting it. You're not seeing it. They still didn't get it, didn't realize that he was referring to the Father. And then further on in the passage, it says, I know you are Abraham's descendants. So they've claimed to be the descendants of Abraham. I know that you're Abraham's descendants. But I also know you're trying to kill me because my message hasn't yet penetrated your thick skulls. That's the way Peterson puts it, but it's exactly the point. He says, my message has not penetrated your thick skulls. They just weren't getting it. Jesus said, if you were Abraham's children, you would have been doing the things Abraham did. and yet here you are trying to kill me, a man who has spoken to you the truth he got straight from God. Abraham never did that sort of thing. So he's making the point to them, you're just not understanding what I'm saying to you. Now, and this is a point about Abraham's been brought into the conversation, and Jesus is saying you need to be like Abraham. So in what sense? Well, let's go back to the passage in Origin that I was going to show you. I'll bring that up again, and hopefully you will see this. So, Origen's preface on the Gospel of John in paragraph 37, he says, "We must not, however, forget that the sojourning of Christ with men took place before his bodily sojourn in an intellectual fashion to those who were more perfect and not children, and were not under pedagogues and governors. In their minds, they saw the fullness of the time to be at hand. The patriarchs, which of course would include Abraham, and Moses, the servant, and the prophets who beheld the glory of Christ." So when I first read that, although Origen's not specifically talking there about John 8:58, but the principle and what he's explaining explained to me immediately what's going on in John 8:58. Origen's saying that the patriarchs, including Abraham, had basically intellectually understood the meaning of the prophecies with regard to the seed, and that they could see the Christ in the future, that the promised Messiah would come to fulfill the prophecies, which began in Genesis chapter 3:15 with the promise of the seed to crush the serpent's head. And then Abraham was promised a son to whom he would become the father of many nations. And this promised seed, by this promised seed, all the nations of the earth would bless themselves. So Origen is saying that by their mind's eye, in their minds, their intellect, they could see this promise being fulfilled in the future. And it was because they had a spiritual intelligence, a spiritual maturity, that they were able to see these things through the eye of faith. As Origen says, that they were not children, they were not under pedagogues and governors, meaning that a pedagogue was like a moral tutor who guided a young person into their adulthood until they were able to stand on their own 2 feet, as it were. So a mature person would be able to, spiritually mature, would be able to understand these things and see through the eyes of faith of Christ coming in the future. So, as Origen says, the sojourning of Christ took place before his bodily sojourn in an intellectual fashion. Now, when I was studying this last year, I was the privilege of being lectured from the quite famous Father John Bear of the Eastern Orthodox Church, and his comments on this passage. He had said, in other words, if the coming of Christ is not so much a narrative of a past event, but the presence of Christ in the present in those who are willing to receive him, then he was already present, had come in those righteous of the Old Testament. So what he's saying is that with the spiritual intellect and maturity in the mind's eye, that these ones like Abraham were able to understand and appreciate the presence of the Christ, being there, being present back in the day, although it was still a future fulfillment. It was as if the Christ was present with them at that time through their eyes of faith. So if we then go back to John 8:58, yeah, Peterson again represents this really nicely, where he says, but I do know, and I'm doing what he says, Abraham, your father, with jubilant faith, looked down the corridors of history and saw my day coming. He saw it and cheered. Right? So I think that expresses that really nicely. He looked down the corridors of history and saw my day coming. He saw it and cheered. The Jews said, "You're not even 50 years old." Right? Now, the next bit I want to just read to you from, we're looking at the King James Version, which is typical of most English translations. In this verse, where it says, "Thou art not yet 50 years old, and hast thou seen Abraham?" Okay, and looking at the New English Bible, yeah, we get a different take on this. So the King James says, "Hast thou seen Abraham?" And if you look at most English translations, they say much the same. They were saying to Jesus, what you have seen Abraham, right? Um, and it's like they've got it. They've totally misunderstood Jesus. Jesus wasn't saying that he had seen Abraham. He wasn't saying he was bodily present um, before Abraham. Um, they're thinking that Jesus has said that he was there. You have seen Abraham. But if we look at the New English Bible, the New English Bible here, interestingly, and it says here, oh, I got the wrong verse. You're not yet 50 years old. How can you have seen Abraham? Okay, so they've got the same reading as the King James. How can you have seen Abraham? But it has a footnote, and it says that there's an alternative reading where it says, "How can Abraham have seen you?" And that's also the reading that Peterson takes. You're not even 50 years old, and Abraham saw you. So that actually, those alternative readings from different manuscripts actually show that the correct understanding is that they were questioning whether Abraham had seen Jesus, but in most translations, it's the other way around. And the Pharisees are accusing Jesus um, of having seen Abraham, right? So that is what has led to the sort of Arian view of the Jehovah's Witnesses, to think that we're talking here about Jesus being pre-existing his bodily sojourn in the first century. Um, it wasn't that Jesus saw Abraham, right? It was that Abraham had saw Jesus' day, not even had saw Jesus, but had saw the prospect of the Messiah coming, and it had seen Jesus' day. That's the correct meaning of it. So the point Jesus is making, that Abraham, living centuries before the fulfillment of the promise that was given to him, could still see in his mind's eye that fulfillment, that promised seed, the promised Messiah coming in the future, even though he wasn't going to physically, literally see it, but he was seeing it with his eyes of faith, with his spiritual intellect. And the point Jesus is making to the Pharisees is that the Pharisees are standing in front of Jesus. Jesus is the seed, the promised Messiah, and they're looking at him with their physical eyes. They're hearing his words with their ears, and they're not seeing and hearing it. They're not doing what Abraham had done by, Abraham had obviously opened up his heart to faith, to believe. Jesus is saying, you're hard-hearted, your eyes are blinded, you're not willing to see the truths. Because they were basically, earlier on in the passage, they're basically saying, you're from Galilee and you're a bastard child as far as we're concerned. You're not born of a virgin, you're a bastard child. For these reasons, they're saying, you're nothing to us. We're the Pharisees, we're learned scholars of the scriptures. You're a Galilean, you know. Jesus is saying, you've closed your eyes of faith. So even though I'm standing in your presence, you don't see me. Whereas Abraham saw me with his eyes of faith. And that's the point. So I want to now share screen again, and I want to share a document from a book by a chap called Navis, who wrote a very good article examining these very things and looking at this verse. So what did Jesus mean by before Abraham was I am, or I am he? What was he really getting at? Because the Jehovah's Witnesses, they look at this verse and say, oh, this means Jesus existed before Abraham, so he must have pre-existed in heaven. But is that the only way that this could be taken? Because remember, it's talking about before Abraham. Now here's the question. Was Abraham born Abraham? Well, no, he was born as Abram. If we check Genesis chapter 16 and 17, Abraham was given the promise from God that he would have a son and that his seed would come through that son and become the father of many nations. And at that point, when the seed and the promise had been made to Abraham, God changed his name to Abraham. Okay? So the point is that the promised seed, the promised Messiah, came before Abraham became Abraham. Right? So therefore, when Jesus is saying, before Abraham, I am, right? We're talking here about precedence, priority, in the sense of the importance. The Jews were claiming to be important because they were the sons of Abraham, right? And they were saying to Jesus, what you're greater than Abraham? And Jesus is saying, well, I come before Abraham for a fact. See, because he knew he was the promised seed, he was the Messiah. And the promise came before the name Abraham. Abraham only comes into effect after and as a result of the promise. So therefore, Jesus is saying, I actually come first before Abraham in priority and importance. So this study that we're looking at, this chap Navis does an excellent job on this. And he's looking at the passage and he's saying, maybe Jesus did mean, I have been in existence before Abraham was born, as the Jehovah's Witnesses think. But he goes on to say, but maybe that really he meant, I have been in existence, brackets, in God's plan and foreknowledge before Abraham was born. Not that I literally, personally existed as God's son. So he's been very even-handed and he's looking at the two ways of it. But that's the point. It's makes so much more sense from what we've been going through, was that the Messiah, the promised seed, existed in God's plan and in his foreknowledge from the beginning. It was from Genesis 3:15 in the Garden of Eden that the promise was made for this promised seed. Abraham was given more information that it was going to come through his own line of heritage. So it's not that Jesus was born physically or existed before. It's the fact that the promise of him was made and guaranteed before Abraham, so that Jesus existed or pre-existed in God's mind and God's plan, not a literal pre-existence. And on this point, looking at a footnote here from another publication by these chaps Broughton and Southgate in the book The Trinity, True or False, they explain this really well, where they say, however, they argue, before Abraham was born, Christ was, in the sense that he was envisaged as the one through whom God and estranged man would become reconciled. A glance at the context of the word shows that was in Christ's mind. The Jews were claiming the privileges of descent from Abraham, whilst Jesus replied that if they were his children, they would do what Abraham did. And as we saw, he rejoiced to see my day, and he saw it and was glad. Whereas the Jews who were actually living in the day of Christ did not recognize it. So we are specifically told in what sense Abraham saw Christ's day. It was in prospect, as an expression of his faith in the coming of Abraham's seed. Through this belief, Abraham foresaw the coming day of Christ. But it was all in prospect. Abraham did not believe that his future son was already in existence in heaven. And this too is what Jesus was saying in his reply to the Jews. He reaffirms the fact that he was present in the plan of God even before the time of Abraham. He could say this without any suggestion of his personal pre-existence. So there we have it. I hope that's quite clear. So basically, he was saying that any pre-existence here was in God's mind and God's plan. Not that Jesus pre-existed in heaven as a spiritual being or an archangel Michael, as the Jehovah's Witnesses believe. But we're talking here about Abraham foreseeing the coming day of the Christ in the future. So that's what Jesus was meaning. That's what the Pharisees just weren't getting. They just weren't understanding this. So we'll leave it at that for this video. That's really looking at what Jesus was actually meaning when he said, before Abraham was, I am. But the passage then goes on to talk about the Pharisees wanting to pick up stones and kill Jesus, stone him to death. And a lot of Trinitarians point to that part of the context and say, oh, surely he was claiming to be God because they wanted to stone him for blasphemy. But don't forget, we've seen here that in this passage, the Pharisees just were completely not getting the gist of what was going on here, what Jesus was saying. They were misunderstanding everything. So if you're thinking that they wanted to stone him because they believed he was saying he was God, that's maybe a further misunderstanding. So next time, we're going to look at what the Pharisees were thinking, why they thought the way they did, and why they wanted to stone him. And this brings out even further meaning as to what's actually going on in this passage. So thank you for watching. Please press like if you've liked the video, subscribe if you haven't already done so, and please come back for the next video because you don't want to miss what I'm going to show you about this passage, what was in the Jews' mind, or the Pharisees' minds, what they were thinking, why they were thinking it, and again, how this also helps us to understand exactly what Jesus was meaning and getting at here in this passage, so that we can understand this passage correctly and a Unitarian Christian understanding of what's actually happening here. So hopefully that's been clear enough. Hope you've enjoyed it and hope to see you the next time. Thanks again. Bye bye now.